The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speaker and do not necessarily reflect the views of the host, content creators, or the production company.
Welcome to the Foundations of Freedom with Jerome Huyler. A strong, vigorous economy runs on a division of labor. While some produce the goods, others provide the services we, the people, need and want. But behind everything we do, our work, our businesses, our daily lives, are the political decisions our leaders make in our name. Since we elect the men and women who write the laws that create the conditions in which we all prosper or perish, we all need to be fully informed political participants. The silent majority can no longer afford to remain silent. One of the most valuable services a free people require is the clarification of complex social, economic, and political ideas. Other media platforms offer biting commentary on the hot-button headlines of the day. This podcast service will explore the underlying causes of and the effective cures for what ails us. And this nation is ailing. Ultimately, to preserve the American dream, we will have to retrieve the principles that made that dream possible. But there are more pressing issues and concrete decisions to consider. So please stay tuned.
Good afternoon, everybody. Here it is about 1 o'clock in Brooklyn, New York, where I am sitting. I'd like to welcome everybody to this podcast. And thank you once again, Vlad, for being a part of it, an important part of it. And here we are ready to go with episode number 19 already. And that is going to be called How Limited Was Limited Government Meant to Be?
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah, it's been amazing. I can't believe episode 19 already. So this is a great topic for the Foundations of Freedom podcast. This is really something that I think it's not taught too much today anymore in schools or even at home. And so let's kick it off. So one of the things we'll be talking about today is how Ronald Reagan used to tell Americans. He said, government is too big and spends too much. So just to put that numbers on that, in Ronald Reagan's final year in office, this was 1988. I know some of you may not have been around for that, but I definitely remember those days. The federal government spent 1.064, over $1 trillion, $1.064 trillion total spending receipts with over $900 billion. So the budget deficit came out to, I think, 155 or more than $155 billion. So the question is, was that too much? Now, fast forward to today. It's 2026. The 2025 budget totaled about $7 trillion and left us with an annual deficit of over $2 trillion. It's like you say that, but I don't think most people can comprehend the we're not talking billions now, we're talking trillions, okay? $2 trillion. So how much bigger can our government get? How much longer can this go on? When did we lose all our control of the budgeting process in our country? And what can we actually do about it? In other words, how limited was limited government meant to be? So in this episode, we're going to take a deep look back into the country's early history. We're going to see America through the eyes of our nation's founding fathers and try to measure just how far we've drifted from what they believed government exists to do, what it should not do. What is its real role? So Dr. Huyler says the only way to make America great again is to retrieve the vision of man and government that enabled this country to become great in the first place. No lesser solution will accomplish any lasting good. So what makes Dr. Huyler confident that he can retrieve the founding fathers' vision? Well, he spent the better part of his adult life studying this topic. His PhD dissertation was on the philosophy of Locke and the founding of America. It was edited and released in 1995 under the title Locke in America, The Moral Philosophy of the Founding Era. You can find this book and order it from Amazon.com. You'll find the links on our website on jeromehuyler.com if you'd like, or just search for it on Amazon. And since most of us are basically unfamiliar with the founders of America through no fault of your own. Again, like I said, this stuff is not taught widely in most schools, not all schools, but in a lot of schools. Dr. Huyler actually suggests you study this episode in depth. Go over it more than once. There's going to be a lot of content. And because at the core of all this, Dr. Huyler believes, and I believe, that a nation is only as great as it is free. And that brings us to the core of this episode, Jerry. What does it really mean to be truly free?
I'm going to get to that a little later, but by the end of this episode, everyone will understand what freedom is. Long before the end of the episode, people will understand. Now, most people will tell you that societies must keep up with the times. They have to adapt to changing conditions. What is expected to work in primitive wilderness conditions cannot be expected to work in a highly complex 21st century social setting. That's just common sense, right? Wrong. There is an alternative viewpoint, and it is the one the nation's fathers explicitly adopted. America's founders believed there are universal principles or norms that can and should be upheld in any historical period. They didn't think that protecting free speech, a free press, religious liberty, the rights of the accused, or even the right to keep and bear arms were temporary measures subject to repeal with the progress of social development and the exigencies of time. Why is that? The founders believe that there are undeniable, universal truths that are good for all times and places. More fundamental and significant is the proposition, or I should say most fundamental and significant is the proposition that all men, and now women, are created equal.
Equal in what sense? What makes the claim irreversibly true? And what does that imply about the function and purpose of our government?
Those are the operative questions. The man who most directly influenced America's founders was the English philosopher John Locke. He never set foot in America. He lived from 1642 to 1704, long before 1776. Though he never set foot in America, his ideas informed and energized the men who drafted the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, and 11 years later returned to Philadelphia to draft the U.S. Constitution. We will briefly capture the essence of Locke's political thought a little further on. But the founders' reasoning was most immediately grounded in the discoveries of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, particularly his understanding of the natural world and the conditions required for any living thing's survival. Locke believed as much. Locke followed Aristotle in this understanding. From an infinite number of observations, Aristotle inductively concluded that all living things live for a time, then perish. There is a cycle of life. Members of every species come into the world active, energetic, healthy, and vigorous. For every species that possesses consciousness is there tool of survival. For the higher species below man, survival is automatic. Animals act on instinct. They are wired to use their specific capacities to satisfy their peculiar needs. Aristotle thus spoke of an unavoidable cycle of corruption and decay. Eventually, every living thing ages, suffers illness, and passes away. No living being gets out of here alive. The same is true for every human being, but men are different from the lower animals in one crucial respect. Men cannot act as all lower species act, on instinct. Man is able to think, to reason. Men have free will and can determine their course of action. Human beings, thus, must use their minds to satisfy their unavoidable needs, to discover those needs, and to make sure they are obtained. Men must decide what is and isn't good for them and act accordingly. Living in a rich, often extensive social setting, everyone requires the freedom to do just that, to live and let live. Since this is true for every individual, no one is authorized by nature to interfere with another's freedom to think, speak, and act as he or she judges best. So it is the very condition of human survival that mandates human liberty. America's founders needed a way to identify, authorize, and protect this broad freedom of action in a social context. They found that way in the Lockean conception of individual natural rights, being of equal creation, sharing the faculty of reason that makes human survival and flourishing possible. Every man and woman possesses the natural, indefeasible right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as Jefferson declared in his immortal Declaration of Independence. That is the universal truth to which the founders devoted their considerable energies. It is the sense in which Jefferson pronounced the fact that all men are created equal. It was as true in 1776 as it is today, and will be 100 or 1,000 years from now. Although this understanding was severely breached, certainly with respect to African slaves and women, it is the irrepressible foundation upon which the nation was founded. It took the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and the women's rights movement to finally correct the grave injustice done to those groups at the country's founding and establish true equality for all. Thankfully, those battles are behind us. This broad understanding is encapsulated in two statements expressed by the man who taught the founders right from wrong. This was the English philosopher, as I said, John Locke. In the second treatise of government, he wrote, and this is key, there is nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank, promiscuously born to all the same advantages of nature and use of the same faculties, should be equal one amongst another, without subjection or subjugation. He also said, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, and reason is that law, and teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions, unquote. Jefferson said, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Locke said, as I noticed a moment ago, there is nothing more evident than that creatures of the same species and rank. This is Jefferson copying Locke's own formulation. And Jefferson said, all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is what true freedom consists of. While Jefferson did not allude to the protection of property, substituting the pursuit of happiness, he certainly intended to include the protection of life, liberty, and property. As John Dickinson explained during the Revolutionary period, quote, let these truths be indelibly impressed on our minds, that we cannot be happy without being free, that we cannot without being secure in our property, that we cannot be sure in our property if without our consent others may by take it away, unquote. If liberty is largely consumed in labor, and the just fruit of one's labor is one's property, whether obtained as wages, salary, or ordinary business profits, then the absolute right to gain, keep, use, trade, or otherwise dispose of one's property must be honored and not politically sacrificed for the sake of any expedient or special interest. Some Americans understood the point perfectly, as when George Mason crafted the Virginia Bill of Rights a few months before Thomas Jefferson sat down to compose the Declaration of Independence. On behalf of the Patriots of Virginia, George Mason explained, quote, and this is part of the Virginia Bill of Rights to this day, quote, that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights, of which when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety, unquote. 4 years later, in 1780, John Adams inserted the very sentiment into the Massachusetts state constitution. He wrote, quote, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which must be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness, unquote. For what then was government needed? Its sole role was to protect citizens in the enjoyment of what was already theirs, their lives, liberties, and possessions. Government was in no way authorized to deprive some in order to benefit others.
Where is that written, Jerry?
After invoking the individual rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson went on to insist that, quote, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed, not from any king, not from any emperor, not from any dictator, but from the consent of the governed. It is the governed that consents to empower their governors. But here's the crucial, pivotal point. If all men are to enjoy their inalienable rights, there is only so much power to which the governed can consent, as no one may take away or give away what belongs to another. No number of men can confer such a power on Congress or any other political body. In short, government was meant to be a protector of our liberty, not a provider giving us special privileges, which it could only obtain by depriving other men of what is theirs. It cannot provide anyone anything without first depriving others of some of their property. And that's precisely what original American government was designed to not accomplish. Today, the principles embraced by John Locke and the founders lay buried beneath 2 centuries of corrosive corruption, because the all-important self-evident truths embedded in the Declaration did not explicitly find their way into the Constitution. The founding principles lost the power to steer the course of human events during and following the founding era. In their place were put the general welfare and necessary and proper clauses of the Constitution. Phrases so loose and ambiguous as to allow passage of nearly any power cunning men can conceive. Locke and Jefferson demanded an unyielding commitment to the plain, practical ability of all to live and let live. The principles raised at the time of the Revolution, principles that informed the crafting of the U.S. Constitution, were meant to serve all the people. It was only, quote, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity that the framers met in the spring and summer of 1787 to hammer out our fundamental frame of government. The term that best describes this arrangement is known as individualism, the idea that each person owns the product of his or her own effort and that government exists for the benefit of the individual, not the other way around. Whatever is owned by the individual who, through his personal labor or her personal labor and free market exchanges, acquires it. In short, whatever a person owns, that earns, whatever a person earns, that person owns and may do with it as he or she pleases. The principle of individualism was overturned in America long ago, and not just for former slaves and Native Americans. The opposite of individualism is known as collectivism. Under this arrangement, individuals may still hold nominal title to their property, but possession is not exclusively theirs, for government can impose innumerable political mandates, directives, and heavy taxes on the citizens' holdings. Today, Congress reserves to itself the power not just to regulate property, but to take away and give away as much as it pleases. In the United States, collectivism is known as the corporate social welfare state. It is what the rest of the world calls socialism.
If what a person earns then he or she exclusively owns, well, how is government supposed to finance its vital operations? Will it have to rely on voluntary contributions? And has that ever worked in the past? Has that ever even been attempted?
Under the original form of government, which was called the Articles of Confederation, voluntary contributions from the several states were not forthcoming. Congress would ask the states for sums of money, but most cases, they never received the revenue they required. Congress had no means of repaying the debt that was left by the Revolutionary War or financing its day-to-day operations. What's the answer? One idea that has been proposed is a lottery, like many states and municipalities have. A lottery may work to finance the cost of government, or taxes just may have to be imposed. Given every individual's inviolable right to gain, keep, use, trade, or otherwise dispose of his or her possessions, how can taxation possibly be morally permissible? I'd like to quickly advance two brief arguments that could be used to justify government's employment of taxation. First, government must acquire warships, aircraft, tanks, trucks, missiles, small arms, ammunition, military uniforms, and many more material items. Governments must guarantee payment to all the contractors and corporations from which it purchases those much needed goods and services. Such guarantees of payment can only be made if there is a steady flow of tax revenue to the public coffers. Otherwise, government contracts for all kinds of items, and if it has to rely on voluntary contributions, and those voluntary contributions are not forthcoming, all of the contractors, military contractors, corporations are stuck. If they are stuck, they will no longer supply the goods and services governments need in order to protect the citizens. So that is one argument in favor of the legitimacy of taxation. A second argument, it's not that government can never use coercion to protect the people. Upon conviction under due process, a jury can take away a criminal's freedom altogether or put the miscreant to death if the charge against him is proven and is serious enough. Even wholly innocent people can be forced against their will to comply with law enforcement officers. A suspect who is presumed innocent before he is tried can be held for questioning or interrogated at a local police precinct. A material witness can be subpoenaed and compelled to testify in a court of law. These actions are absolutely essential if justice is to be served, if the guilty are to be brought to the trial and justice is to be rendered. John Locke himself asserted, quote, "It is true governments cannot be supported without great charge, and it is fit everyone who enjoys his share of the protections should pay out of his estate his proportion for the maintenance of it." Now, argument 4, government has to protect all in the enjoyment of what is theirs. If taxation were purely voluntary, those who fail to pay their taxes would become dependents of those who did pay for the support of government's essential services. Why should taxpayers pay for the protection of all those freeloaders who are not paying their fair share? couldn't the protections freeloaders enjoy be said to be welfare benefits? The real point is this: if all government does is furnish a strong national defense and perform the requisite law enforcement and justice functions, the cost of running government would be surprisingly modest. Current budgets for these vital protection services come in at around $900 billion. Total federal spending this year in 2025 approached $7 trillion. If consigned to its proper functions, the American taxpayer might enjoy the same fate the taxpayers of ancient Rome enjoyed during the first and second centuries. The typical working Roman citizen in those 2 centuries worked roughly 2 days a year to pay his taxes. Rome's government was confined to a narrow range of essential functions. There was no cumbersome and expensive bureaucratic agencies taxpayers had to fund or comply with. Nor was there a giant population of government dependents. Consider how affordable life would be if that circumstance prevailed here and now. However, once government begins conferring special benefits or privileges on some, it thereby denies equal protection under law to all. For if all are created equal, none are entitled to anything another will have to pay for. As Jefferson would urge, witnessing the sordid acts of Congress in his later years, quote, "Our legislators do not know the limit of their power to protect our natural rights and take none of them from us."
How about the Constitution then? Can you definitively say that it too was designed to protect the private property of the people?
While the framers of the Constitution fully intended to protect the people's property rights, the language it employed was feeble and woefully inadequate. The Fifth Amendment states, quote, "No person shall be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law." Apparently, the framers of the Constitution believed that language was plain enough. And if we look at George Mason's statement in the Virginia Bill of Rights, John Adams' statement, John Locke's principles, we can see that language should have been adequate to protect property rights. However, in time, the Supreme Court would define due process, the key phrase in that language, as any legal procedure that Congress conducted, no matter how much property would be seized under its auspices. This would be called procedural due process and would be wildly different from substantive due process, which would have protected people in the enjoyment of what was theirs. The Constitution should have stipulated something like, quote, "Every man having the undisputed right to gain, keep, use, trade, or otherwise dispose of his freely acquired possessions, Congress shall pass no law taxing or otherwise depriving some for the benefit of others." That would have achieved the full measure of equality Jefferson and his revolutionary brothers intended at the start of the country. If no single individual has a right to take away or give away that which belongs to another, no number of individuals can confer such an awful power on their elected representatives.
So then, when did we first go amiss? How did we get from that day to this?
It may be argued that the origins of the American welfare state can be traced to the second bill signed into law by our first president. The Tariff Act of 1789 imposed tariff duties on imported industrial goods. That directly benefited domestic manufacturers who, owing to the reduced competition from abroad, could raise their prices and reap higher profits. Subsequent tariff legislation all across the 19th century imposed progressively stiffer duties on imported goods across, and thus further benefited domestic manufacturers. As a result, however, Western farmers, Southern planters, in fact, every consumer had to pay artificially higher prices for the tools, utensils, textiles, weapons, and other manufactured goods they purchased. Shipbuilders lost business due to the loss of international trade, as did seaport merchants and thousands employed in the maritime trades. Not being able to ship or sell their goods in the American market, Europeans lost the will and the wherewithal, the finances, to purchase American, mainly agricultural, but other products as well. Cotton would no longer be king. Cotton had formerly been the single largest export Americans made money on. Now, there would be a much reduced demand on the part of Europe for American agricultural products, grains as well as cotton, and they would lose. So some Americans, domestic manufacturers, lobbied Congress and got their way with Congress and got these tariff duties raised steadily at the expense of other Americans. That is why, and that is the sense in which these tariff duties can be considered a welfare payment. How did we get from that day to this? Here's the principle. Once the nation decided that some of its citizens had a right not to go out and get, but to lobby Congress and be given, it faced two daunting questions. Who else should be given, and how much should everyone get? There was only one possible answer: politics. My dear followers, we the people should effect a fundamental transformation of our society, not by invoking Barack Obama's collectivist vision of America, funding more agencies and finding better bureaucrats and politicians to run them, but by retrieving and restoring America's first principles. That means making government what it was originally meant to be: a protector, not a provider.
Wow, that was quite a lot of information to process and absorb, I'd say. But I think for I think what would help, and for anyone who would like more context, I'd point you back to our previous episode 18, where we walk through the case against welfare, why fraud and overspending are inevitable once government moves beyond its proper role as the protector, and why most ordinary taxpayers like us and future generations end up footing the bill. Jerry, I've got a question for you. I'm gonna put you on the spot here. Let's imagine if the founding fathers were sitting in the room with us today, what do you think would shock them the most about our modern government?
I think the founders would be most shocked by the absence of property rights. Private property, as I indicated during this whole discussion, was central to the founders' view of government and man and freedom. The freedom to gain, keep, use, trade, or otherwise dispose of our freely acquired possessions. That was an absolute principle that should govern at all times and all places. Yet today, the principle of private property is thrown out the door, thrown out the window, completely ignored by the fact that Congress can take away and give away as much property as it pleases to benefit anyone who has a claim on that property. People are not, there is not a great deal of direct theft. People do not rob other people, and people who do rob other people are regarded as criminals and apprehended and tried, and if convicted, they are sentenced to long prison terms for that theft of property. However, Congress reserves to itself the right to take away and give away as much property as it pleases, depending on how many lobbyists, how many special interests, or how many elections swing to collectivists who think that people are entitled to free healthcare, free apartments, free housing, free food, or anything else. That, I think, would most shock the founding generation if they were alive today, to see what goes on.
Thanks, Jerry. And thanks to everyone joining us on yet another episode of the Foundations of Freedom podcast with Jerome Huyler. If there's one takeaway today, it's this: America's crisis isn't just about debt, deficits, or bad budgeting. It's about forgetting what government was meant to be in the first place. The founders believed freedom rests on clear limits, individual rights, and a government designed to protect, not provide or manage or redistribute. What we've tried to do in this episode is reconnect today's challenges with the first principles: natural rights, equality under the law, property, consent of the governed, and the moral boundaries of political power. These weren't ideas meant only for the 18th century. They were meant to apply always, and especially when government grows large, complex, and is tempted to exceed its proper role. Now, if this conversation challenged you, don't let it stop here. Go back, study these ideas for yourself. Read the founding documents. Revisit thinkers like Locke and Aristotle, and so many others. And most importantly, ask whether the system we live under today still reflects the principles we claim to believe in. Share this episode with someone who's worried about the direction of the country like we are, and join us next time on the Foundations of Freedom podcast with Jerome Huyler, where we will continue asking the hardest and most necessary questions about liberty, responsibility, and the future we're leaving to the next generation. See everybody next time. Thanks and be well.
Thank you very much, Vlad. A very excellent summary of what this episode was designed to convey. Very good.
Thanks, Jerry. See you next time.
See you all next time.
In both life and business, knowing when enough is enough. Lao Tzu once said, "He who knows that enough is enough will always have enough." This ancient wisdom highlights the power of simplicity. In search engine optimization, overloading a page with keywords or plugins can ruin performance. Knowing when to stop is crucial. Simplicity ranks better, on Google and in life. Embrace moderation for success.